In the grey light of a July morning in 1588, from a cliffside watchtower on the coast of Cornwall, an English lookout saw it first. It was not a fleet, but a moving forest of masts that seemed to fill the horizon. This was the Spanish Armada, a floating city of war sent to crush a nation. 130 vessels, from towering war galleons to heavy supply ships, advanced in a vast, seemingly unbreakable crescent formation that stretched 7 miles from tip to tip. It was the physical manifestation of an empire's will, a spectacle of power designed to awe and terrify. The sheer scale was an act of psychological warfare. Banners bearing the crest of King Philip II of Spain snapped in the wind, alongside crucifixes and the standards of Catholic saints. The decks of the great ships swarmed with nearly 20,000 of the most disciplined soldiers in Europe. For the fishermen and coastal villagers who watched its silent, inexorable approach, this was not merely an invasion force. It was judgment itself, gliding upon the waters of the English Channel. This terrifying sight was not a sudden act of aggression, but the violent culmination of a decades-long Cold War. To understand the Armada, one must pull back from the shores of England and view the grand geopolitical chessboard of the 16th century. It was a world split by ideology, a clash between two visions for the future of Europe. The conflict was the ultimate expression of the ambitions of two rival monarchs and the empires they commanded. On one side stood Philip II of Spain, the most powerful man in the world. His empire spanned the globe, fueled by the immense silver and gold of the Americas. A devout Catholic, Philip saw himself as God's sword on earth, divinely ordained to defend the true faith against the heresy of Protestantism. From his stone palace, the Escorial, he sought to impose a universal order, a world united under one king and one church. Opposing him was Elizabeth I of England, ruler of a small, defiant island nation. Her very existence as a Protestant queen was an affront to Philip's worldview. England had become a haven for Protestant rebels from Spanish-controlled lands and, more critically, a base for privateers. These sea dogs, state-sanctioned pirates like Sir Francis Drake, had for years plundered Spain's treasure fleets, draining the wealth that powered Philip's imperial machine and challenging his mastery of the seas. The clash was therefore inevitable, a collision of power, faith, and economic ambition. The Armada was Philip's final, decisive move to end the English problem permanently. It was designed not merely to defeat a rival, but to extinguish an idea, the idea that a small nation could defy a superpower and chart its own course. The ships sailing up the Channel carried more than soldiers. They carried the weight of an entire worldview. Yet this battle would not be decided by numbers or religious fervor alone, but by a revolution in wood and iron. The conflict was a stark mismatch of military doctrines, a contest between two fundamentally different philosophies of naval warfare. The Spanish galleons were magnificent floating fortresses with high castles at the bow and stern. They were built to fight a land battle at sea, their purpose being to get close, grapple the enemy ship, and allow their elite infantry to board and overwhelm the opposing crew with sword and pike. In contrast, the English fleet represented a new and deadlier concept. English shipbuilders had developed a new type of vessel, a more nimble galleon that was longer, lower in the water, and far more maneuverable. These ships were not designed as transports for soldiers, but as mobile gun platforms. The English strategy was revolutionary: to avoid grappling at all costs and use their superior speed and the faster reloading cannons to batter the Spanish from a distance, crippling their ships before they could ever close in. The fate of England would thus hang on a simple, brutal question of physics and strategy. Could the Spanish force the close quarters fight their fleet was designed for, or could the English maintain the distance required for their artillery to prevail? The two fleets were built to fight two completely different wars, and they were now sailing toward each other in the narrow confines of the English Channel, where only one doctrine could triumph. This strategic and technological divide was mirrored in the minds behind the fleets. Spain's commander was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a brave and highly capable aristocrat, but he was a general of armies, not an admiral of fleets. He had no significant naval experience and had begged King Philip not to give him the command. He was a man of immense honor, tasked with executing a rigid, unforgiving plan conceived by a distant king, a plan that left little room for adaptation in the chaotic reality of battle at sea. The grand Spanish strategy, the Enterprise of England, was a masterpiece of logistical planning on paper, yet it contained a fatal flaw born of arrogance. The plan was not a simple naval invasion. Instead, it was a complex, two-part maneuver demanding perfect timing and coordination across hundreds of miles of hostile water. The Armada's primary mission was to sail up the English Channel, secure the narrow Strait of Dover, and act as an impenetrable shield for the Duke of Parma's seasoned army of 30,000 men to cross from the Netherlands. This intricate design was the plan's ultimate weakness. It depended entirely on the seamless union of two massive, independent military forces, with communication limited to slow-moving pinnaces navigating enemy seas. There was no deep-water port for the Armada to safely anchor and wait. There was no room for delay, no allowance for weather, and no contingency for an enemy that refused to fight by the established rules. The entire weight of a kingdom's ambition rested on a clockwork mechanism that had no tolerance for the friction of war. As the Armada sailed into English waters, the first phase of this delicate plan began to unravel. The English fleet, emerging from Plymouth, was initially trapped by the tide and wind, but soon began a relentless pursuit. For a week, a great, slow-motion chase unfolded up the Channel. The Spanish, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, maintained a disciplined, tightly packed crescent formation, a defensive posture that was nearly impossible for the English to break. The English commanders, Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard, understood they could not win a traditional battle. Their ships were outgunned in close-quarters combat, where Spanish galleons could use their height and legions of soldiers to board and overwhelm smaller vessels. So they changed the rules of the engagement. The English ships, more nimble and weatherly, danced just outside the range of the Armada's heavy, short-range cannons, using their superior long-range culverins to harass the Spanish fleet, chipping away at the giant's strength from a safe distance. This was a new form of naval warfare, a battle of attrition and maneuver rather than a decisive, brutal clash. The English fired, darted away and returned, aiming to damage rigging and hulls, to wound and demoralize, and to exhaust the Spanish ammunition reserves. While few Spanish ships were sunk in these initial encounters, the psychological pressure was immense. The invincible fleet was being led, harried, and bled, unable to land a decisive blow against its phantom-like tormentor. The chase culminated as the Armada reached the French coast, dropping anchor at the port of Calais. Here, the plan's critical flaw was laid bare. Medina Sidonia sent word to the Duke of Parma, whose army was miles away in Bruges, stuck and unready, with his transport barges blockaded by Dutch flyboats. The Armada was now a stationary target, waiting for an army that could not come. For the English, it was a moment of desperate opportunity. They were dangerously low on ammunition, but they knew the Spanish formation had to be broken. And broken now. The English High Command convened a council of war. A direct assault was suicide. A prolonged blockade was impossible due to their dwindling supplies. Out of this strategic corner came a plan of terrifying and ancient simplicity, repurposed with diabolical genius. They would not attack the Spanish ships with their own fleet. They would turn the very forces of wind and tide against the anchored enemy, using a weapon of pure psychological terror. On the dark, moonless night of August 7th, this desperate gamble was set in motion. The English took 8 of their own vessels, merchant ships and smaller warships, and packed them with anything that would burn: pitch, brimstone, gunpowder, and tar. They loaded their cannons, which would discharge on their own as the heat intensified, creating a horrifying illusion of a crude attack. These were the hell-burners, unmanned instruments of chaos, set ablaze and sent drifting silently toward the heart of the anchored Spanish fleet. As the glowing ships of fire appeared out of the darkness, panic erupted among the Spanish crews. They had heard tales of these devastating weapons from the siege of Antwerp. The sight of the approaching inferno, combined with the random thunder of exploding cannons, created an atmosphere of pure terror. Spanish captains, fearing their ships would be engulfed in flames, made a fateful decision. In the chaos, they ordered their crews to cut their anchor cables to escape. This was the moment the English had been waiting for. The fireships themselves did little direct damage, but their psychological impact was total and catastrophic. The great, disciplined crescent formation, the Armada's single greatest strength, was shattered. 130 ships, now anchorless and at the mercy of the wind and current, were scattered in disarray into the treacherous waters of the North Sea. The Invincible fleet was broken, not by cannon fire, but by fear. As the sun rose on August 8th, the full, devastating consequence of the English fireships became terrifyingly clear. Spain's magnificent armada, once a symbol of divine order and imperial might, was now a scattered, panicked herd drifting helplessly towards the treacherous sandbanks off the coast of Gravelines, Flanders. The disciplined crescent formation was shattered, its command structure in chaos. For the English commanders watching from their decks, this was the moment of truth. The Spanish giant was wounded, disoriented, and trapped against a hostile shore. Now, the technological and tactical superiority of the English fleet was unleashed with brutal efficiency. Possessing the weather gauge, the crucial upwind position, the smaller, faster English ships closed in for the kill. They did not attempt to board, a tactic the Spanish galleons were built for. Instead, they danced just outside the range of the Spanish heavy cannons, firing relentless broadsides into the towering, unwieldy hulls of their enemy. It was a new kind of naval warfare, one of distance, speed, and overwhelming firepower. The Battle of Gravelines was not a battle of equals, it was a slaughter. For 8 grueling hours, English cannonballs ripped through Spanish oak, shattering masts, tearing sails, and decimating the crowded decks of the galleons. The Spanish, unable to bring their own heavy guns to bear effectively, and with gunners poorly trained for rapid reloading, could do little but endure the punishment. By the end of the day, several Spanish ships were sunk or sinking, and thousands of their best soldiers and sailors were dead or wounded, their grand invasion plan dissolving into the blood-churned waters of the English Channel. The final, decisive blow, however, came not from a cannon, but from the heavens. After the mauling at Gravelines, a powerful southwesterly wind began to blow with relentless force. This gale, which the English would later celebrate as the Protestant wind, sealed the Armada's fate. It pushed the battered fleet inexorably north, away from the coast of Flanders and any hope of rendezvousing with the Duke of Parma's army. The gateway to England was slammed shut not by a wooden fleet, but by an atmospheric force. With the English navy shadowing them and the winds against them, the Spanish commanders faced a grim reality. Their only path home was a perilous, desperate voyage north around the storm-battered coasts of Scotland and then south past the treacherous western shores of Ireland. It was a journey for which they were utterly unprepared, with damaged ships, dwindling supplies, and crews weakened by battle and disease. The great enterprise had failed. Now, the struggle was for survival. The aftermath was a catastrophe for Spain. Of the 130 grand ships that had sailed from Lisbon with such ceremony and confidence, barely 60 managed to limp back to Spanish ports. Thousands of men had been lost to English cannons, but thousands more were claimed by the storms, starvation, and the unforgiving Atlantic coastline of Ireland, where shipwrecked sailors were often killed by locals. The loss was not just military, but psychological, a staggering, humiliating defeat on the world stage. This defeat shattered the carefully constructed myth of Spanish invincibility, a belief that had intimidated European rivals for decades. Conversely, it ignited a powerful sense of national pride and destiny in England. The victory was cast as a divine miracle, proof of God's favor for the Protestant cause and its queen. The legend of Queen Elizabeth I, the defiant monarch who had faced down the world's greatest power, was forged in the fires of this naval triumph, becoming a cornerstone of English identity for centuries to come. Picture for a moment the vast geopolitical chessboard of the 16th century. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not merely a stroke of luck or a miracle. It was the stark outcome of a systemic failure colliding with a systemic success. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of power, where old certainties were being challenged by new, dynamic forces that were reshaping the world. The ultimate lesson of the Armada is the victory of adaptability over rigid strength. Spain's power was rooted in a grand but inflexible system. Massive ships designed for a bygone era of warfare, a top-down command that stifled initiative, and a strategic plan that left no room for error. England's victory was born from innovation and pragmatism. Faster ships, superior gunnery, and experienced, independent-minded commanders who could react to a changing battlefield. History had turned a page, and the future would belong not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable.